Beneath the soil we walk on, beneath the cities we have built, beneath the jungles we have never dared to enter, there are secrets. Secrets that have waited in silence for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, for tens of thousands of years. They are buried in tombs sealed by volcanic eruptions. They are carved into bones older than agriculture itself. They are etched into stone pillars raised by people who, according to everything we thought we knew, should not have been capable of raising them. These secrets do not merely tell us about the past. They force us to rethink everything we believed about who we are, where we came from, and what our ancestors were truly capable of achieving. This is a journey across continents and across millennia. From the highland valleys of southern Mexico, where a 1,400-year-old tomb was found guarded by a stone owl, to the rose-red cliffs of Petra in Jordan, where 12 skeletons and a mysterious chalice lay, hidden beneath one of the most photographed monuments on Earth. From the frozen plains of prehistoric Europe, where Neanderthals organized sophisticated hunting operations that rival anything modern humans have conceived, to the hills of southeastern Turkey, where a 12,000-year-old stone temple shatters the conventional timeline of human civilization. From the scorching deserts of the Sinai Peninsula, where a massive Roman-era fortress once transformed barren sand into a thriving industrial hub, to the impenetrable depths of the Amazon rainforest, where laser technology has revealed entire cities that nobody knew existed. Along the way, we will examine Ice Age carvings that may represent the world's earliest data storage systems, and we will confront some of the most audacious hoaxes in the history of archaeology, forgeries so clever and so brazen that they fooled scientists, journalists, and entire nations for years, sometimes for decades. Every discovery you are about to encounter challenges something. Some challenge our assumptions about ancient technology. Some challenge our understanding of ancient intelligence. Some challenge the very definition of civilization itself, and a few challenge our ability to distinguish between what is real and what we desperately want to be real. This is the story of what happens when the earth gives up its dead, when the ground cracks open and reveals a world we never imagined. This is the story of echoes from the forgotten world. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. The state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico is a land of contrasts. Sharp mountain ridges cut through valleys blanketed in green. The air is thin in the highlands, warm and humid in the lowlands. For thousands of years, this region has been home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations in Mesoamerican history, cultures that built pyramids, developed writing systems, charted the movements of the stars, and buried their dead with extraordinary care and ritual precision. Among the most prominent of these civilizations were the Zapotec people. The Zapotec civilization flourished in the valley of Oaxaca for well over 1,000 years, and at its height, the great city of Monte Alban was one of the most powerful urban centers in all of Mesoamerica. Monte Alban sat on a flattened hilltop, a city literally carved into the sky, with temples, plazas, ball courts, and elaborate tombs that reflected a complex society deeply invested in honoring the dead. But Monte Alban was not the only Zapotec settlement. Across the valley and into the surrounding mountains, smaller towns and ceremonial centers dotted the landscape. And it was in one of these smaller communities, a place called San Pablo, that a discovery was made that would captivate the archaeological world. The tomb was found in the kind of circumstances that remind us how much of history still lies hidden just beneath our feet. Construction workers, digging for an entirely modern purpose, struck something unexpected. Their tools hit stone where there should have been only earth, and as they carefully cleared away the dirt, they realized they had broken through the ceiling of an underground chamber, a chamber that had been sealed for approximately 1,400 years. What they found inside was remarkable. The tomb was in a state of preservation that stunned even veteran archaeologists. In many ancient burial sites, time and the elements have taken a heavy toll. Water seeps through cracks, roots push through walls, insects and rodents make their way inside, and the slow, relentless chemistry of decay transforms once vibrant artifacts into dust and fragments. But this tomb was different. It had been sealed so thoroughly, protected so completely from the intrusions of the natural world, that when researchers first lowered themselves into the chamber, they found it almost exactly as it had been left more than a millennium ago. The walls of the tomb were adorned with paintings. These were not crude scratches or faded smears of pigment. They were vivid, carefully executed murals depicting figures and symbols drawn from the rich cosmology of the Zapotec world. The colors, though softened by the passage of centuries, were still visible, still legible, still powerful. Reds and yellows and blacks formed the outlines of deities, of ritual scenes, of the spiritual geography that the Zapotec people believed awaited the dead in the afterlife. But perhaps the most striking feature of the tomb was not inside it, it was at its entrance. Standing guard at the threshold of the burial chamber was a carved stone figure of an owl. The owl was not large, but it was exquisitely detailed, rendered with a level of craftsmanship that spoke to the importance of whatever or whoever lay within. Its eyes were wide and watchful, its feathers carefully delineated, its posture one of eternal vigilance. In Zapotec culture, as in many Mesoamerican traditions, the owl was a creature of profound symbolic significance. It was a creature of the night, of darkness, of the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The owl was a guardian, a sentinel, a spiritual protector tasked with watching over the passage from one realm to another. To place a stone owl at the entrance to a tomb was not merely decorative. It was a deliberate, deeply meaningful act, a way of ensuring that the person buried within would be protected on their journey through the underworld. The presence of the owl also suggested something about the status of the individual interred in the tomb. This was not a common burial. The level of care and craftsmanship that had gone into the construction and decoration of the chamber, the quality of the offerings placed alongside the body, and the presence of the guardian figure all pointed to someone of considerable importance, perhaps a ruler, a high priest, or a member of the ruling elite. Inside the tomb, alongside the skeletal remains, archaeologists found a collection of grave goods. These included ceramic vessels, some of them decorated with the same kinds of symbolic imagery found on the walls. There were jade ornaments, highly prized in Mesoamerican cultures and often associated with royalty and the divine. There were shells brought from distant coastlines, evidence of the long-distance trade networks that connected the Zapotec world to other civilizations across Mesoamerica. Each of these objects told a story. The ceramics spoke of artistic traditions passed down through generations. The jade spoke of wealth and power. The shells spoke of connections to the wider world, of merchants and emissaries traveling hundreds of miles to exchange goods and ideas. Together, they painted a picture of a society that was not isolated, not primitive, not simple, but connected, sophisticated, and deeply thoughtful about the relationship between life and death. The discovery of the tomb at San Pablo also raised important questions about the Zapotec civilization during the period in which the tomb was constructed. 1400 years ago places the burial roughly in the late Classic period of Mesoamerican history, a time of great cultural flowering, but also a time of increasing political instability. Monte Alban, the great Zapotec capital, was beginning its long decline during this era. Power was fragmenting, shifting away from the central city and toward smaller regional centers. The San Pablo tomb, with its elaborate construction and high-status burial, may reflect this decentralization. It suggests that even as Monte Alban's influence waned, the cultural and religious traditions of the Zapotec people continued to thrive in outlying communities. The knowledge of how to build a proper tomb, how to decorate it with the appropriate imagery, how to select and arrange the proper offerings, and how to carve a guardian owl with the proper reverence, all of this survived the political upheavals of the era. This is one of the most important lessons that archaeology teaches us. Civilizations do not simply vanish overnight. They transform, they adapt, they redistribute their energy and their knowledge. The end of a great city does not necessarily mean the end of a great culture. Sometimes it means the culture has simply found new homes, new expressions, new ways of carrying forward the traditions that define it. The stone owl of San Pablo still watches. It has watched for 14 centuries. It watched as empires rose and fell, as new peoples arrived in the valley, as the world above the tomb changed in ways that the person buried inside could never have imagined. And now, brought back into the light, it watches over a new chapter in the story, the chapter in which we, the living, try to understand and honor what the dead left behind. Roughly 500 miles to the northwest of the Zapotec heartland, in a sprawling metropolis that is today one of the largest cities on the planet, another discovery was waiting beneath the earth, and this one was even older. Mexico City is a place where the ancient and the modern exist in constant, sometimes uneasy, proximity. The city was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, which itself was built on an island in the middle of a vast lake. But the history of this region goes back far beyond the Aztecs, far beyond even the great civilizations that preceded them. Beneath the colonial-era buildings and the modern skyscrapers, beneath the Aztec temples and the pre-Aztec settlements, there are layers of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. It was in one of these deep layers, near the iconic Chapultepec Park, that archaeologists uncovered a series of graves unlike anything they had seen before. These were not the stone-lined tombs of the Zapotec or the elaborate burial chambers of the Aztec nobility. They were something stranger, something older, something that spoke of a burial tradition that predated the great Mesoamerican civilizations by centuries. The graves were shaped like bells. Each burial consisted of a narrow shaft dug down from the surface, which then opened up into a wider, rounded chamber below. The result was a cross-sectional profile that resembled the outline of a bell, with the narrow shaft forming the handle and the expanded chamber forming the body. The deceased were placed in the lower chamber, sometimes in a seated or crouched position, and surrounded by offerings before the shaft was filled in and sealed. These are known as bell tombs or shaft and chamber tombs, and they represent one of the oldest burial traditions in the region. The examples found near Chapultepec were approximately 3,500 years old, placing them in the early formative period, a time when the first permanent agricultural villages were being established in the Valley of Mexico and the earliest complex societies were beginning to take shape. The age of these tombs is significant for several reasons. 3,500 years ago, there were no Aztecs, no Maya, no Zapotecs as we know them. The great civilizations of Mesoamerica had not yet emerged. Instead, the landscape was populated by small farming communities, clusters of families who cultivated maize, beans, and squash, who made pottery by hand, and who were just beginning to develop the social hierarchies and religious practices that would eventually give rise to the great temple cities. The bell tombs suggest that even at this early stage, these communities had developed a sophisticated understanding of death and burial. The effort involved in digging a shaft and chamber tomb is considerable. It requires not only physical labor but also a knowledge of soil mechanics, an understanding of how deep you can dig before the walls begin to collapse, and a sense of spatial planning to ensure that the lower chamber is wide enough to accommodate the body and the grave goods. These were not hasty, improvised burials. They were carefully planned and executed. The grave goods found within the tombs were relatively modest compared to the lavish offerings found in later Mesoamerican burials, but they were meaningful. There were simple ceramic vessels, perhaps intended to hold food or drink for the journey to the afterlife. There were stone tools and ornaments. There were traces of organic materials that had long since decayed but whose outlines could still be discerned in the soil. But what made these particular bell tombs especially remarkable was the manner in which they had been preserved. The region around Chapultepec has a violent geological history. It sits in a zone of intense volcanic activity, and over the millennia, eruptions from nearby volcanoes have periodically blanketed the landscape in ash and lava. One of these eruptions from a volcano known locally as Zittel, or sometimes rendered in historical texts with various spellings, played a crucial role in the preservation of the bell tombs. The eruption occurred some 2,000 years ago, well after the tombs had been sealed and forgotten. A massive flow of lava poured across the landscape, covering everything in its path under a thick layer of igneous rock. Villages were buried, agricultural fields disappeared. And the bell tombs, already deep underground, were sealed beneath an additional layer of volcanic material so dense and so impermeable that nothing could reach them. For 2 millennia, the tombs sat in a state of near-perfect isolation. No water penetrated, no roots intruded, no scavenging animals disturbed the burials. The volcanic seal acted as a natural vault, preserving the tombs and their contents with a fidelity that would have been impossible under normal conditions. When archaeologists finally reached the tombs, they found them in extraordinary condition. The bell-shaped chambers were intact, their walls still smooth and curved. The skeletal remains were in positions that had not shifted since the day of burial. The grave goods were exactly where they had been placed 35 centuries earlier. This is one of the paradoxes of volcanic destruction. The same forces that devastate the living can preserve the dead with uncanny precision. We see this most famously at Pompeii and Herculaneum, where the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 of the Common Era destroyed 2 thriving Roman cities, but also preserved them in such detail that we can still read the graffiti on their walls and examine the food left on their tables. The bell tombs near Chapultepec are a less famous but equally striking example of this phenomenon. The discovery of these tombs also shed light on the early history of the Valley of Mexico, a history that is still poorly understood. The great civilizations of the region, Teotihuacan, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, have received enormous attention from historians and archaeologists. But the people who came before them, the small-scale farmers and village dwellers of the early formative period, remain largely mysterious. Their settlements were modest, their material culture was relatively simple, and the passage of time has erased much of the evidence of their existence. The bell tombs are a rare window into this shadowy era. They tell us that even in these earliest days of settled life in the valley, people cared deeply about their dead. They invested significant time and effort in constructing proper burials. They provided offerings for the afterlife. They developed a distinctive burial tradition, the bell-shaped shaft and chamber tomb, that reflected a particular set of beliefs about death and what comes after. What those beliefs were exactly, we can only speculate. There are no written records from this period, no inscriptions, no codices. The people of the early formative did not have writing. They communicated their ideas through oral tradition, through the arrangement of their villages, through the patterns on their pottery, and through the way they treated their dead. The bell tombs are one of the most eloquent forms of this communication, a message sent across 35 centuries, telling us that even at the dawn of civilization in this part of the world, the living honored the dead with care, with thought, and with reverence. The volcanic layer that sealed these tombs is a reminder of something else as well. It is a reminder of the fragility of human life in a geologically active landscape. The people who dug the bell tombs lived in a world of volcanoes. They could see the peaks from their villages. They could feel the tremors beneath their feet. They knew, perhaps from stories passed down through generations, that the mountains could awaken and pour destruction across the land, and yet they stayed. They built their villages, planted their crops, buried their dead, and carried on with the business of living. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout human history. People do not flee from danger, they adapt to it. They incorporate it into their understanding of the world. The volcanoes of the Valley of Mexico were not just threats. They were features of the landscape, part of the world as it was known and understood. The people of the early formative lived with the volcanoes the way people everywhere live with the particular hazards of their own environments, with a mixture of caution, resignation, and the stubborn determination to make a life in the place where they find themselves. And so they dug their bell-shaped tombs into the earth, placed their dead inside with care and offerings, sealed the shafts, and moved on with their lives. They could not have known that a volcano would one day add its own seal to the tombs, preserving them for a future they could not have imagined. They could not have known that people living thousands of years later would open those tombs and marvel at what they found. But perhaps, in some way, that is exactly what they hoped for. Perhaps every burial in every culture and every era is an act of faith, a belief that the dead deserve to be remembered and that someday someone will find them and remember. We have traveled from the highlands of Oaxaca to the volcanic valley of central Mexico, examining tombs separated by centuries and by very different cultural traditions. Now our journey takes us to a place that is perhaps the most visually dramatic of all the archaeological sites we will visit, a place carved from living rock, painted in shades of rose and crimson by the desert sun, a place that has captivated travelers and scholars for centuries. We are going to Petra. Petra lies in the southwestern corner of Jordan, nestled in a narrow canyon surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs. To reach the ancient city, you must pass through the Sick, a winding, narrow gorge barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The walls of the Sick rise hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out the sky, creating a passage that feels more like a journey into the interior of the earth than a walk through a canyon. And then, as you round the final bend, the gorge opens and you see it. Al-Khazne, the treasury. It is one of the most recognizable monuments in the world. Carved directly into the face of a sandstone cliff, its elaborate facade rises more than 130 feet high. Columns and capitals in the Hellenistic style frame a grand entrance. Above the entrance, a broken pediment shelters a central figure, often identified as Isis or Tich, the goddess of fortune. The entire structure is carved from the living rock, not built from blocks but sculpted out of the cliff itself, as though the mountain had been hollowed out to reveal the architecture hidden within. For centuries, Al-Khazne has been the subject of legend and speculation. Local Bedouin traditions held that the urn at the top of the facade contained the treasure of a pharaoh, and bullet holes still visible on the urn testify to attempts by treasure hunters to break it open and claim the riches within. In reality, the urn is solid stone. There was never any treasure inside it, at least not the kind of treasure the bullet holes suggest. But there was treasure at Petra, real treasure. The kind of treasure that matters to archaeologists, the kind that tells us about the people who built this extraordinary place and the civilization they created. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, a civilization that thrived from roughly the 4th century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. The Nabateans were originally nomadic Arabs, traders who moved goods across the desert, linking the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia with the markets of the Mediterranean world. Over time, they settled, built cities, developed agriculture in one of the most arid environments on Earth, and created a culture that blended elements from Arabia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the ancient Near East. The Nabateans were above all masters of water. In a region where rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, they developed an elaborate system of dams, channels, cisterns, and aqueducts that captured every drop of rainwater and distributed it throughout the city. This hydraulic engineering was so effective that Petra, a city in the middle of the desert, was able to support a population estimated at 20 to 30,000 people at its height. But despite decades of archaeological investigation, much about Petra and the Nabateans remains mysterious. The Nabateans left relatively few written records. Their language is known primarily from short inscriptions on tombs and temples. Their religious practices are only partially understood. And the full extent of the city, which covers an area of more than 100 square miles if you include the outlying settlements and agricultural terraces, has never been completely excavated. It was against this backdrop of partial knowledge and enduring mystery that a team of researchers made a discovery that would add a dramatic new chapter to the story of Petra. The discovery was made directly in front of Al-Khazne, the treasury itself, in an area that had been visited by millions of tourists but that had never been fully excavated to the depth that modern archaeological methods require. Previous investigations had established that the area in front of the treasury was not simply an open plaza, but had been built up and modified over centuries, with layers of construction and fill material accumulating over time. But the deepest layers had remained unexplored. When the team finally reached those deepest layers, they found a tomb. It was hidden beneath the surface, sealed and undisturbed, directly in front of the most famous facade in Petra. Inside the tomb were 12 skeletons, 12 individuals buried together in a single chamber beneath the shadow of the treasury. The skeletons were in varying states of preservation, but all were clearly ancient, dating to the Nabatean period. The manner in which they were arranged suggested that this was not a hasty or improvised burial. The bodies had been placed with care, their positions deliberate, their arrangement reflecting some logic or ritual that the researchers were only beginning to understand. The number 12 is significant in many ancient cultures. It appears in astronomical systems, in mythological traditions, in the organization of tribes and clans. Whether the number 12 had specific significance for the Nabateans is not yet known, but the deliberate burial of exactly 12 individuals in a single tomb directly in front of the city's most important monument is unlikely to be coincidental. Among the grave goods found with the skeletons was a ceramic chalice, a drinking vessel of unusual form and craftsmanship. The chalice was intact, its surface decorated with patterns that combined elements of Nabatean, Greek, and Near Eastern artistic traditions. It appeared to be a ritual object, something used in ceremonies rather than in everyday life. Its presence in the tomb suggested that the individuals buried there may have been connected to the religious life of the city, perhaps priests, perhaps participants in some important ceremony, perhaps individuals who held a particular spiritual status in Nabatean society. The chalice also raised questions about Nabatean religious practices. The Nabateans worshipped a pantheon of deities, including Dashara, the chief god, often represented as a block of stone, and Al-Uzza, a powerful goddess associated with Venus. Their religious ceremonies are known to have involved communal dining and drinking, with participants sharing food and wine in rituals that reinforced social bonds and honored the gods. The chalice found in the tomb may have been connected to such rituals, a sacred vessel used in communal worship and then buried with the dead as a mark of their religious devotion. The discovery of the tomb and its contents opened new lines of investigation into several aspects of Nabatean civilization. First, it provided new data about Nabatean burial practices. While the great rock-cut tombs of Petra are well known and extensively studied, less is known about simpler, below-ground burials like the one found in front of the treasury. The existence of such burials suggests that the monumental tombs, impressive as they are, represent only one part of a more complex and varied set of funerary traditions. Second, the tomb provided new skeletal material for biological and forensic analysis. The bones of the 12 individuals could be studied to determine their ages at death, their sexes, their health and nutritional status, and potentially their geographic origins. DNA analysis, if the preservation of the bones permitted it, could reveal information about the genetic makeup of the Nabatean population, their relationships to one another, and their connections to other populations in the region. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, the location of the tomb raised questions about the function of the treasury itself. Al-Khazne has been variously interpreted as a tomb, a temple, a treasury, and a combination of these. The discovery of a burial directly in front of it, in a location that would have been highly visible and symbolically charged, suggested a close connection between the monument and the dead. It is possible that the treasury was not merely a tomb for a single important individual, but a focal point for a broader funerary and ritual complex, a place where the living came to honor the dead and to perform ceremonies that connected the two realms. Petra, for all its fame, is still yielding its secrets. Every excavation reveals new layers, new structures, new artifacts, and new questions. The city was occupied for centuries, and during that time it was constantly being rebuilt, redesigned, and reimagined. What we see today is not a single moment frozen in time, but a palimpsest, a document that has been written and rewritten and overwritten many times, with each layer preserving traces of the layers that came before. The 12 skeletons and their ceramic chalice are one more layer in this palimpsest. They are a reminder that beneath the surface of what we think we know, there are always more stories waiting to be told. Petra is not a dead city. It is a city that is still speaking, still revealing, still surprising us with the depth and complexity of the civilization that created it. The Nabateans, those former nomads who turned the desert into a garden and carved a metropolis from the living rock, left behind a legacy that is still being discovered, still being interpreted, still being understood. And every new discovery, from the grandest facade to the humblest grave, brings us closer to understanding who they were and what they achieved. From the desert canyons of Jordan, our journey now takes us to a very different landscape, one that requires us to travel not just across space but deep into time, far deeper than we have gone so far. We are going to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, to a site that has fundamentally altered our understanding of human history. We are going to Gobekli Tepe. To appreciate the significance of Gobekli Tepe, you must first understand the story that archaeologists and historians told about the origins of civilization before this site was excavated. That story went something like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved in small bands, following the migrations of game animals and the seasonal availability of wild plants. They had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no domesticated animals. Their tools were made of stone, bone, and wood. Their social structures were relatively simple, based on kinship and the practical demands of survival. Then, approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, in a region known as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean coast through modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, something changed. People began to cultivate wild grains, selecting and planting the varieties that produced the most food. They began to domesticate animals, keeping sheep, goats, and cattle in managed herds rather than hunting wild game. This transition, known as the Neolithic Revolution, is often described as the single most important turning point in human history. With agriculture came surplus. With surplus came permanent settlement. With permanent settlement came larger communities. With larger communities came social stratification, specialization of labor, organized religion, monumental architecture, and eventually writing, cities, and all the other hallmarks of what we call civilization. In this traditional narrative, the sequence was clear. First came farming, then came villages, then came temples. The logic seemed unassailable. You cannot build a temple unless you have a settled community. You cannot have a settled community unless you have agriculture. Therefore, temples and other monumental structures must have come after agriculture. Gobekli Tepe destroyed this narrative. The site was first noticed in the 1960s by a survey team that identified unusual stone fragments on a hilltop near the city of Şanlıurfa. The surveyors noted the stones but did not investigate further, apparently assuming they were the remains of a medieval cemetery. It was not until the 1990s, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisited the site, that the true nature and significance of the place began to emerge. What Schmidt and his team found was staggering. Buried beneath the hilltop were massive stone pillars arranged in circles. The pillars were T-shaped, some of them standing more than 18 feet tall and weighing many tons. They were carved from local limestone and transported to the hilltop, a feat that required significant labor and coordination. Many of the pillars were decorated with elaborate relief carvings depicting animals, including foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, boars, snakes, and other creatures. Some of the pillars also bore carved arms and hands, suggesting that they represented stylized human figures, perhaps ancestors, deities, or other supernatural beings. The circles of pillars were not haphazard arrangements. They were carefully planned and precisely executed. Each circle consisted of multiple pillars arranged around a perimeter, with two larger pillars standing at the center. The spaces between the pillars were filled with stone walls, creating enclosed chambers. The floors were made of polished limestone, smooth and level. All of this was impressive enough, but the truly revolutionary aspect of Gobekli Tepe was its age. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site established that the oldest structures were approximately 12,000 years old, dating to the 10th millennium before the Common Era. This made Gobekli Tepe older than pottery, older than metalworking, older than the wheel, older than writing, and critically older than agriculture. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were not farmers, they were hunter-gatherers. They did not live in permanent villages. They did not cultivate crops. They did not keep domesticated animals. And yet they built a monumental stone complex that required the coordinated labor of hundreds, possibly thousands of people over an extended period of time. This was, to put it mildly, a problem for the traditional narrative. If the sequence was supposed to be farming first, then settlement, then temples, what was a massive stone temple doing on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, built by people who had not yet invented farming? How could hunter-gatherers living without surplus, without permanent homes, without social hierarchies have organized and sustained a construction project of this magnitude? The answer, as Schmidt and subsequent researchers proposed, was that we had the sequence backwards. It was not farming that led to temples. It was temples, or more precisely, the social and spiritual needs that temples served, that led to farming. The desire to gather in large groups for ritual purposes, to build and maintain a sacred site, to feed the workers and the worshippers, these were the forces that drove people to settle down, to cultivate wild grains, to domesticate animals. Civilization did not produce religion. Religion produced civilization. This hypothesis remains debated, and there are scholars who dispute certain aspects of the interpretation, but the basic facts of Gobekli Tepe are not in dispute. The site is 12,000 years old. It was built by hunter-gatherers. It is monumental in scale, and it predates agriculture. To understand the effort involved in building Gobekli Tepe, consider the logistics. The stone pillars were quarried from limestone bedrock a short distance from the hilltop. Quarrying a single pillar required cutting a large block of stone from the bedrock, shaping it into the desired T-form, and then transporting it to the construction site. The largest pillars weigh more than 10 tons. Moving a 10-ton block of stone without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, requires an enormous amount of human labor and a sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The pillars then had to be raised into position, set into prepared sockets in the ground, and stabilized so that they remained upright. Carved decorations had to be executed with stone tools, patiently chipping and grinding the limestone to create the detailed relief images of animals and other figures. The walls between the pillars had to be constructed, the floors had to be leveled and polished, and the entire complex had to be maintained over the years and decades of its use. All of this was accomplished by people who, in every other respect, lived a pre-agricultural lifestyle. They hunted wild game. They gathered wild plants. They did not live in one place year-round, and yet they repeatedly returned to this hilltop over a period of centuries to build, to carve, to gather, and to perform whatever rituals took place within the stone circles. What were those rituals? This is one of the great unanswered questions of Gobekli Tepe. The animal carvings on the pillars are vivid and varied, but their meaning is not self-evident. Are they totemic symbols representing the clans or tribes of the people who gathered at the site? Are they cosmological figures depicting the animals that populated the spirit world? Are they narratives telling stories of hunts, of myths, of supernatural encounters? The presence of vultures on several pillars is particularly intriguing. In many ancient cultures, vultures were associated with death and the afterlife. They were seen as creatures that carried the dead from the earthly realm to the sky, a form of excarnation or sky burial. The prominent depiction of vultures at Gobekli Tepe has led some researchers to suggest that the site may have been connected to funerary rituals, to practices involving the treatment of the dead. Supporting this interpretation is the discovery of numerous human bone fragments at the site, some of which show signs of deliberate modification, including cut marks that suggest the bones were defleshed after death. This is consistent with excarnation practices, in which the dead were exposed to the elements and to scavenging birds before their bones were collected and deposited at a sacred site. If Gobekli Tepe was indeed a place where the dead were processed and honored, it would represent one of the earliest known examples of a specialized funerary site in human history. It would mean that 12,000 years ago, long before the first cities or the first written words, people were gathering at a designated place to perform complex multi-stage rituals for the dead, rituals that required monumental architecture, communal organization, and a shared set of beliefs about what happens after death. but it is also possible that Göbekli Tepe served multiple functions simultaneously. It could have been a place for funerary rituals and for other kinds of ceremonies, gatherings for feasting, for alliance building, for trade, for the resolution of disputes between groups, for astronomical observation, or for initiation rites. The circles of pillars, with their enclosed spaces and their towering central figures, would have created a powerful sense of enclosure and sacred space, a place set apart from the everyday world, a place where the boundaries between the human and the supernatural were thin. One of the most remarkable aspects of Göbekli Tepe is that the builders appear to have deliberately buried the site after they were finished using it. Layer after layer of fill material, mostly rubble and soil, was deposited over the stone circles, gradually covering them until the entire complex was hidden beneath an artificial hill. This deliberate burial is what preserved the site so well, protecting the pillars and their carvings from erosion and weathering. But it also raises the question of why. Why would people spend generations building a monumental site and then deliberately bury it? One possibility is that the burial was a form of ritual termination, a way of ending the life of the sacred site in a manner that honored its purpose. In many ancient cultures, buildings and objects were deliberately destroyed or buried at the end of their useful life as a way of releasing the spiritual power they contained. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may represent this kind of ritual act, a way of closing the sacred space and returning it to the earth from which it came. Another possibility is that the burial was connected to a change in the social or religious practices of the people who used the site. As the transition to agriculture progressed, as people settled into permanent villages and developed new forms of social organization, the old gathering place on the hilltop may have become obsolete. The rituals that had once brought people together from across the region may have been replaced by new ceremonies performed in village settings. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may mark the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the spiritual life of the community. Whatever the reason, the burial ensured that Göbekli Tepe would survive for future generations to discover, and when it was finally uncovered, it rewrote the history books. The implications of Göbekli Tepe extend far beyond the site itself. If hunter-gatherers were capable of building a monumental stone complex 12,000 years ago, what else might they have been capable of that we have not yet discovered? How many other sites are out there, buried beneath hillsides and farmland, waiting to be found? And how much of what we think we know about the early history of our species will have to be revised in light of future discoveries? These are humbling questions. They remind us that the past is not a settled account, not a finished story with all the chapters written and all the conclusions drawn. It is an ongoing investigation, a puzzle that is constantly being expanded by new pieces. Every discovery, every excavation, every analysis of a potsherd or a bone fragment or a carved stone pillar has the potential to change our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Göbekli Tepe is a monument to the ambition and imagination of our ancestors. It is also a monument to our own ignorance, a reminder of how much we still do not know about the earliest chapters of the human story. From the astonishing stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, we now shift our attention to a topic that challenges not just our understanding of ancient architecture, but our understanding of ancient minds. We are going to look at some of the oldest artifacts ever created by human hands, objects so old that they come from the depths of the last ice age, and we are going to ask a question that would have seemed absurd just a few decades ago. Did our ice age ancestors have hard drives? The question is deliberately provocative, and of course, we are not talking about electronic data storage devices. What we are talking about is something arguably just as remarkable, evidence that humans living 34,000 to 45,000 years ago may have developed complex symbolic coding systems, ways of recording and transmitting information using marks carved into pieces of bone. For more than a century, archaeologists have been finding carved bones at Paleolithic sites across Europe and beyond. These bones, typically from the limbs or ribs of large animals, bear series of notches, lines, dots, and other marks that appear to be deliberately incised rather than the result of butchering or natural wear. Early interpretations of these marks varied widely. Some researchers dismissed them as idle doodling, the ancient equivalent of absent-minded scratching. Others suggested they were decorative, intended to make the bone objects more visually appealing. Still others proposed that they were counting systems, ways of keeping track of quantities, perhaps the number of animals killed in a hunt or the number of days in a lunar cycle. But more recent computational analysis has suggested something far more sophisticated. Using statistical methods and pattern recognition algorithms, researchers have examined the marks on these ancient bones and found that they are not random. They are not decorative, and they are more complex than simple tally marks. The marks appear to follow rules. They exhibit patterns that recur across different bones, different sites, and different time periods. They show evidence of a structured system, a system with its own internal logic, its own syntax, its own grammar. In other words, the marks appear to be a form of notation, a way of encoding information in a systematic and reproducible manner. If this interpretation is correct, it has profound implications. It would mean that tens of thousands of years before the invention of writing, before the Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, before the Egyptians carved hieroglyphs into temple walls, early humans were already developing ways to record and store information. The bone carvings would represent a kind of proto-writing, a precursor to the full writing systems that would not appear for another 25,000 years. What kind of information might these bone carvings encode? Several hypotheses have been proposed. One of the most popular is that the marks represent a lunar calendar, a way of tracking the phases of the moon over days, weeks, and months. The moon would have been of immense practical importance to Ice Age hunter-gatherers. Its phases determined the amount of light available for nighttime travel and hunting. Its cycles were linked to the migration patterns of game animals, the spawning of fish, the growth of plants, and the fertility cycles of both humans and animals. A reliable way of tracking the moon's phases would have been an invaluable tool for survival. Supporting the lunar calendar hypothesis is the observation that many of the notched bones bear sequences of marks that correspond closely to the number of days in a lunar month, approximately 29.5. Some bones show sequences of marks grouped into clusters that match the phases of the moon, with different types of marks, such as lines versus dots, corresponding to different phases, such as the waxing crescent versus the full moon. Another hypothesis is that the marks encode information about animal behavior. Some bones bear images of animals alongside the notational marks, and it has been suggested that the marks may record observations about the animal's seasonal patterns, their breeding cycles, their migration routes, or the times of year when they are fattest and most desirable as prey. If so, the bones would represent a kind of field guide, a portable reference tool that a hunter could carry and consult. A third hypothesis is that the marks are mnemonic devices, aids to memory that help storytellers, ritual specialists, or community leaders remember and recite complex oral traditions. In many pre-literate societies, information is preserved and transmitted through storytelling, song, and ritual performance. These oral traditions can be extraordinarily complex, encompassing histories, genealogies, mythologies, and practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Mnemonic devices, objects that help the performer remember the sequence and content of the tradition, are common in such societies. The carved bones of the Ice Age may have served this function, helping the keeper of traditions remember and transmit the knowledge of the group. Regardless of which hypothesis is correct, and it is possible that different bones serve different purposes, the key insight is the same. Early humans were capable of creating and maintaining complex symbolic systems. They could take an abstract concept, such as the passage of time or the behavior of an animal, and represent it with a series of marks on a physical object. They could create a code, a system in which specific marks carry specific meanings, and they could use that code consistently over extended periods of time. This is not a trivial cognitive achievement. It requires the ability to think abstractly, to separate a thing from its representation, to understand that a mark on a bone can stand for something that is not physically present. It requires the ability to think systematically, to create rules and follow them consistently. And it requires the ability to think temporally, to plan for the future, to anticipate needs, and to create tools that will be useful not just today but weeks and months from now. These cognitive abilities are in many ways the foundation of everything that makes us human. They are the abilities that eventually gave rise to writing, mathematics, science, and all the other systems of knowledge that define our species. The carved bones of the Ice Age suggest that these abilities did not suddenly appear with the invention of agriculture or the rise of the first cities. They were present in our ancestors tens of thousands of years earlier, long before anyone planted the first grain of wheat or laid the first brick. The implications of this are profound and in some ways unsettling. We tend to think of progress as a linear process, a steady march from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex. The carved bones challenge this assumption. They suggest that our distant ancestors were far more cognitively sophisticated than we have traditionally given them credit for. They lived in a world without cities, without writing, without metal tools, but they were not simple, they were not primitive, They were fully human with the same cognitive capacities that we possess, and they used those capacities to create systems of knowledge and communication that served their needs in their world. The difference between their world and ours is not a difference in intelligence. It is a difference in accumulated knowledge. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations, each of which added something to the sum of human knowledge. Our ancestors stood at the beginning of that process with everything still to be discovered. But the mental tools they brought to the task, the ability to think abstractly, to create symbols, to encode information, to plan for the future, these were the same tools we use today. They were the original operating system of the human mind, and they were already running, already sophisticated, already capable of remarkable feats 45,000 years ago. The recognition that our distant ancestors possessed sophisticated cognitive abilities leads naturally to a related question, one that has been the subject of intense debate in the scientific community for decades. What about the Neanderthals? For most of the history of paleoanthropology, Neanderthals were depicted as brutish, dim-witted creatures, a kind of evolutionary dead end, strong but stupid, physically robust but mentally limited. The popular image of the Neanderthal was of a shuffling, grunting caveman, barely capable of the most basic forms of tool use, incapable of language, art, or complex social behavior. This image was always more caricature than reality, and in recent years it has been comprehensively dismantled by a flood of new evidence. We now know that Neanderthals were far more intelligent, far more capable, and far more human than we ever imagined. They made sophisticated tools, they controlled fire, they created art, they buried their dead, they may have had language. And as recent discoveries have shown, they were capable of organizing and executing complex group activities that required planning, communication, and coordination on a scale that would challenge any modern human group. Among the most striking evidence of Neanderthal ingenuity comes from a series of sites where researchers have uncovered the remains of large-scale horse hunts. At these sites, the bones of numerous horses have been found in concentrations that indicate they were not killed one at a time, by individual hunters pursuing individual prey, but in coordinated group events, drives in which multiple hunters worked together to herd, trap, and kill entire groups of horses at once. This kind of hunting strategy is not simple. It requires extensive planning and preparation. The hunters must identify a suitable location, a place where the terrain can be used to funnel and trap the animals, a cliff edge, a narrow ravine, a dead-end canyon. They must study the behavior of the horses, learning their movement patterns, their grazing habits, their reactions to threat. They must coordinate their actions, positioning themselves at specific points around the kill zone and timing their movements to drive the horses in the desired direction. And they must be prepared to deal with the aftermath, butchering multiple large animals in a short period of time before the meat spoils. The archaeological evidence indicates that Neanderthals did all of this. At multiple sites, the bones of horses have been found in configurations that are consistent with drive hunts. The animals were killed in groups, not individually. The kill sites are located in places where the natural terrain would have aided in trapping the animals. And the butchering patterns on the bones indicate that the Neanderthals processed the carcasses efficiently, removing meat, tendons, and other useful materials with a practiced hand. But the evidence goes further than the hunts themselves. Researchers have also found evidence that Neanderthals used advanced food processing techniques that were previously thought to be the exclusive province of modern humans. One of the most significant of these is the rendering of bone grease. Bone grease is exactly what it sounds like. It is the fat contained within the spongy interior of animal bones. To extract it, you must first break the bones into small pieces, then boil the pieces in water. The fat rises to the surface where it can be skimmed off and stored. The resulting grease is a highly concentrated source of calories and nutrients, and in environments where food is scarce and calories are precious, it can mean the difference between survival and starvation. The process of rendering bone grease is not obvious or intuitive. You cannot simply gnaw on a bone and extract the grease. You must break the bone, and not in a haphazard way, but in a specific way that maximizes the surface area exposed to water. You must have a container capable of holding water and tolerating heat, which in a pre-ceramic world means using a naturally occurring vessel such as a stomach or a hide bag or heating stones and dropping them into a water-filled container. And you must understand the principle that fat floats, that it can be separated from water by allowing it to rise to the surface. The evidence that Neanderthals did this comes from the patterns of bone breakage found at their sites. At multiple locations, researchers have found horse bones and other animal bones that have been broken in ways consistent with grease rendering. The bones are fragmented into small, relatively uniform pieces, much smaller than would be necessary for simple marrow extraction. Patterns of breakage are consistent across multiple bones and multiple sites, suggesting a standardized technique rather than random smashing. This is a significant finding. It means that Neanderthals were not merely hunting and eating animals in the most straightforward way possible. They were processing the carcasses to extract every possible calorie, using techniques that required knowledge, planning, and multi-step procedures. They understood the nutritional properties of different parts of the animal. They had developed methods for accessing resources like bone grease that are not immediately obvious, and they applied these methods consistently, passing the knowledge from one generation to the next. The picture that emerges from these discoveries is radically different from the old stereotype of the brutish caveman. Neanderthals were skilled and strategic hunters. They could plan and execute complex group activities. They understood the properties of the materials they worked with. They had the cognitive capacity to develop and maintain multi-step technical procedures, and they were adaptable, capable of adjusting their strategies to the demands of their environment and the resources available to them. This does not mean that Neanderthals were identical to modern humans. There were differences, both anatomical and behavioral, between the two species, but the differences were far smaller than we once believed, and the similarities far greater. Neanderthals were not a failed experiment. They were a successful adaptation, a species that thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in some of the harshest environments on Earth, surviving ice ages and climate fluctuations that would have overwhelmed a less capable species. Their ultimate disappearance, which occurred roughly 40,000 years ago, remains one of the great mysteries of human prehistory. Many factors likely contributed, including competition with modern humans, climate change, and the inherent vulnerabilities of a small population. But whatever caused their extinction, it was not stupidity. The evidence makes that abundantly clear. Neanderthals were smart, resourceful, and resilient. They deserved better than the caricature we created for them, and the ongoing discoveries about their capabilities are a fitting correction to a very old injustice. We have now traveled from 1,400-year-old Zapotec tombs to 3,500-year-old Bell graves, from the rose-red cliffs of Petra to the 12,000-year-old stone circles of Gobekli Tepe, from the carved bones of the Ice Age to the hunting grounds of the Neanderthals. Each of these discoveries has challenged our assumptions about the past, revealing levels of sophistication, ingenuity, and complexity that we did not expect. But there is a shadow side to the story of archaeological discovery, a side that is less inspiring but equally instructive. For as long as people have been finding ancient objects and interpreting them, other people have been making fake ancient objects and passing them off as real. The history of archaeology is not just a history of genuine discoveries. It is also a history of hoaxes, forgeries, and deceptions, some of them crude and quickly exposed, others so clever and so well crafted that they fooled experts for years, even for decades. These hoaxes are worth examining, not because they are amusing, though some of them certainly are, but because they reveal something important about human nature. They reveal our desire to believe, our hunger for the extraordinary, our willingness to accept evidence that confirms what we want to be true and to overlook evidence that contradicts it. The hoaxes of archaeology are mirrors, and what they reflect is not always flattering. Let us begin with one of the most famous archaeological hoaxes of all time, a hoax that fooled an entire nation and became a cultural sensation. In the year 1869, workers digging a well on a farm in the town of Cardiff, in the state of New York, struck something hard beneath the surface. As they cleared away the soil, they uncovered what appeared to be the petrified body of a giant man, more than 10 feet tall, lying on its back in the earth, its features contorted in an expression of pain or surprise. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within days, thousands of people were flocking to the farm to see the giant. The landowner, a man named William Newell, erected a tent over the figure and began charging admission. Scientists, journalists, and the merely curious came from across the region. The Cardiff giant, as it quickly became known, was a sensation. The debate over the giant's nature raged in newspapers and lecture halls. Was it a petrified man, the fossilized remains of a prehistoric giant? Was it an ancient statue carved by some long-forgotten civilization, or was it something else entirely? Some scientists were skeptical from the start. They pointed out that the process of petrification does not work the way the giant's appearance suggested. Real petrification occurs when organic material is gradually replaced by minerals over millions of years, and the result looks like stone, not like a human body lying in the ground. The Cardiff giant, they argued, was too well preserved, too human-looking, too conveniently located to be genuine, but the public wanted to believe. The idea of a real giant, a being from a lost age of titans and demigods, was irresistible. Clergymen cited passages from the book of Genesis about giants walking the earth. Journalists wrote breathless accounts of the discovery, and the money kept pouring in 50 cents a visitor, a substantial sum in 1869. The truth, when it finally came out, was both simple and absurd. The Cardiff giant was a hoax perpetrated by a man named George Hull. Hull was a tobacconist and atheist from Binghamton who had gotten into an argument with a fundamentalist minister about whether the Bible should be taken literally, including its references to giants. Hull decided to create a fake giant and bury it, partly to make a fool of the literalists and partly one suspects to make a profit. Hull commissioned a block of gypsum from a quarry in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and had it shipped to a stonecutter in Chicago, who carved it into the shape of a reclining. To make the figure look more realistic, Hull had the surface treated with acids and stains to simulate the appearance of aged stone. He even had the figure's skin pricked with darning needles to create the appearance of pores. The finished product was then secretly transported to Newell's farm, where it was buried at night. A year later, Hull arranged for workers to dig a well at the exact spot, ensuring that the giant would be discovered. When Hull confessed to the hoax, many people refused to believe him. The desire to believe in the giant was so strong that some insisted the confession itself was the hoax, that the giant was real and Hull was lying about having created it. The showman P.T. Barnum, who had been refused permission to buy the original giant, commissioned his own replica and displayed it, claiming that his copy was the real one and the original was the fake. At one point there were 2 Cardiff giants on display simultaneously, each claiming to be authentic, and both of them were fakes. The Cardiff giant eventually ended up in a museum where it can still be seen today. It is displayed not as a genuine artifact but as a monument to human gullibility, a 10-foot-tall reminder of how easily we can be deceived when we want to believe. The Cardiff giant was a crude hoax, and in retrospect it is hard to understand how anyone was fooled by it. But other archaeological forgeries have been far more sophisticated and far more damaging. Consider the case of the Vinland map. This document, purportedly dating to the 15th century, appeared to show a map of the world that included a landmass labeled Vinland, corresponding to the northeastern coast of the continent now known to be across the Atlantic. If genuine, the map would have been powerful evidence that Europeans had knowledge of the Western Hemisphere well before the famous voyage of 1492. The map surfaced in the 1950s, bound into a medieval manuscript. It was purchased by a wealthy collector and donated to Yale University, which announced its existence with great fanfare in 1965. The timing of the announcement, just before the anniversary of a certain famous voyage, was seen by some as deliberate, an attempt to use the map to shift credit for the discovery of the Western landmass away from one explorer and toward Norse seafarers who had reached those shores centuries earlier. The debate over the Vinland map raged for decades. Historians, cartographers, chemists, and manuscript specialists all weighed in. Some declared the map genuine, pointing to its parchment, its binding, and its stylistic consistency with other medieval maps. Others declared it a forgery, pointing to anachronistic features in the cartography and suspicious aspects of its provenance. The most damning evidence against the map came from chemical analysis of the ink. Tests revealed that the ink contained a form of titanium dioxide known as anatase, which is characteristic of modern synthetic inks but not of medieval carbon-based inks. This finding strongly suggested that the map was drawn with 20th century ink on genuine medieval parchment, a clever but ultimately detectable forgery. The question of who forged the Vinland map has never been definitively answered. Various suspects have been proposed, including scholars, dealers, and pranksters. The motive may have been financial. The map was worth millions of dollars if genuine, or it may have been ideological, an attempt to rewrite history. Or it may have been purely mischievous, a test of the expert's ability to distinguish real from fake. Whatever the motive, the Vinland map serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful thinking and scholarship. The map was eagerly accepted by many who wanted it to be real, because it confirmed a narrative they found appealing. Those who raised doubts were sometimes dismissed or ignored. It took decades of persistent, painstaking analysis to establish the forgery, and even now there are few holdouts who insist the map is genuine. The lesson is clear. In archaeology, as in all fields of inquiry, the desire to believe is both a strength and a vulnerability. It drives us to explore, to investigate, to push the boundaries of knowledge. But it can also lead us astray, causing us to accept evidence uncritically and to dismiss inconvenient doubts. The Vinland map is a reminder that skepticism, applied rigorously and fairly, is not the enemy of discovery. It is its essential companion. If the Cardiff giant represents the low end of archaeological hoaxes and the Vinland map represents the middle range, the case of the Archaeoraptor represents the high end, a forgery so sophisticated that it was published in a major scientific magazine and briefly rewrote the textbooks on dinosaur evolution. The story begins in the late 1990s, at a time when the study of the evolutionary relationship between dinosaurs and birds was one of the hottest topics in paleontology. For decades, scientists had been accumulating evidence that birds are the direct descendants of small, feathered theropod dinosaurs. Fossils from China in particular were providing stunning examples of dinosaurs with feathers, confirming the evolutionary link between the two groups. Into this atmosphere of excitement and discovery came a fossil that seemed too good to be true. It was a small, complete skeleton that appeared to combine the features of a dinosaur and a bird in a single specimen. It had the long, bony tail of a dromaeosaurid dinosaur and the wing and flight feather impressions of a bird. If genuine, it would have been one of the most important transitional fossils ever discovered, a missing link between dinosaurs and birds preserved in exquisite detail. The fossil was acquired from a dealer and eventually found its way to the pages of National Geographic magazine, which published an article about it in November 1999 under the name Archaeoraptor lionensis. The article was accompanied by dramatic illustrations and breathless prose, declaring the fossil a key piece of evidence in the dinosaur-to-bird transition. But almost immediately, problems began to emerge. Scientists who examined the fossil noted inconsistencies in the skeleton. The proportions did not quite match. The rock matrix showed signs of having been assembled from multiple pieces, and when the fossil was subjected to CT scanning, the truth became clear. The Archaeoraptor was a composite, a chimera, assembled from parts of at least two and possibly more different specimens. The body and head came from one animal, a primitive bird. The tail came from another, a small dromaeosaurid dinosaur. The pieces had been skillfully glued together and the joins hidden, creating the illusion of a single, continuous skeleton. The forgery had been perpetrated by fossil dealers in China, where the commercial value of rare fossils creates strong incentives for fabrication. By combining parts from different animals, the dealers had created a specimen that appeared to be far more significant and far more valuable than any of its component parts. The resulting chimera was convincing enough to fool not only the dealer's immediate buyers, but also experienced paleontologists and the editors of a major magazine. The fallout was significant. National Geographic published a correction and an apology. The scientific community was embarrassed, and the anti-evolution movement seized on the episode as evidence that the entire field of evolutionary biology was built on fraud, a claim that was both unfair and incorrect, but that gained traction among those predisposed to doubt the scientific consensus. Ironically, the individual components of the Archaeoraptor turned out to be genuinely important fossils. The bird portion was eventually described as a new species, Yanornis martini, and the tail, which had been the most attention-grabbing part of the composite, came from a small dromaeosaurid that was itself a significant discovery. The real fossils, separated and studied individually, contributed valuable information to the understanding of dinosaur and bird evolution, but their scientific value was overshadowed by the scandal of the forgery. The Archaeoraptor case illustrates several important lessons. First, it shows the pressure that commercial interests can place on science. When fossils are bought and sold as commodities, there is an inherent incentive to make them more impressive, more complete, and more scientifically significant than they actually are. This incentive can lead to forgery, ranging from minor restoration, filling in missing bones with plaster, to outright fabrication, assembling chimeras from unrelated specimens. Second, it shows the danger of rushing to publish without adequate verification. The National Geographic article was published before the fossil had been subjected to the rigorous peer review that is standard in scientific journals. The magazine, eager to scoop its competitors and to present a dramatic discovery to its readers, bypassed the safeguards that might have caught the forgery before publication. Third, and most broadly, it shows the enduring tension between the desire to discover and the discipline of verification. Scientists, like all human beings, want to find important things. They want to make discoveries that change the world. This desire is what drives them to dig in remote locations, to spend years analyzing data, to pursue ideas that others dismiss as impossible. But the same desire can become a liability when it causes them to lower their guard, to accept evidence too readily, to see what they want to see rather than what is actually there. The Cardiff Giant, the Vinland Map, and the Archaeoraptor are three very different hoaxes from three very different eras, but they share a common thread. In each case, the forgery succeeded, at least temporarily, because it told people what they wanted to hear. The Cardiff Giant told a public eager for wonders that giants had once walked the earth. The Vinland map told scholars eager for a revised history that their preferred narrative was correct. The Archaeoraptor told paleontologists eager for transitional fossils that the missing link they sought had been found. In each case, the truth eventually came out. Science, for all its vulnerabilities, is ultimately self-correcting. Hoaxes are exposed, forgeries are detected, false claims are retracted. The process is messy and sometimes slow, but it works. And the very existence of hoaxes, paradoxically, strengthens science because it forces scientists to be more rigorous, more skeptical, and more demanding of evidence. The lesson for all of us, whether we are scientists or simply curious observers of the world, is to hold our beliefs lightly, to question what we are told, to demand evidence. And to remember that the desire to believe, while a powerful and sometimes beautiful force, must always be tempered by the discipline of doubt. We have now traversed a vast landscape of human history and prehistory, from the sealed tombs of ancient Mexico to the hidden graves of Petra, from the world's oldest temple to the carved bones of the Ice Age, from the hunting strategies of Neanderthals to the forgeries that have fooled the modern world. Each of these stories is remarkable in its own right, but together, they paint a picture of a species that is endlessly creative, endlessly curious, and endlessly capable of both greatness and self-deception. In the second part of our journey, we will venture into new territory. We will cross the barren sands of the Sinai Desert to examine the remains of a massive Roman-era fortress that transformed an arid wasteland into a thriving industrial hub. We will penetrate the green canopy of the Amazon rainforest, where laser technology has revealed entire cities hidden beneath the trees. And we will return to the deep past, to Gobekli Tepe and beyond, to explore the spiritual and social forces that drove our ancestors to create the first monumental architecture. But for now, let us pause and reflect on what we have already seen. The stone owl guarding a Zapotec tomb. The bell-shaped graves sealed by volcanic fire. The 12 skeletons and the ceramic chalice beneath the treasury of Petra. The T-shaped pillars of Gobekli Tepe, raised by hunter-gatherers who should not have been able to raise them. The notched bones of the Ice Age, carrying information across tens of thousands of years. The coordinated horse hunts of the Neanderthals, a species we once dismissed as brutes. And the hoaxes, the fake giants and forged maps and assembled chimeras that remind us how easily our desire to believe can lead us astray. Each of these stories is, in its own way, a story about communication. The Zapotec owl communicates across 14 centuries, telling us about a culture that honored its dead with artistic mastery and spiritual conviction. The bell tombs communicate across 35 centuries, telling us about a people who cared enough about the afterlife to dig deep into the earth and shape the soil into elegant chambers. The Petra tomb communicates across 2 millennia, telling us about a civilization that buried its sacred dead in the shadow of its greatest monument. Gobekli Tepe communicates across 12 millennia, telling us that the human desire for meaning, for ritual, for the sacred, is older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing. The Ice Age bones communicate across 45 millennia, carrying encoded information from a world so remote in time that we can barely imagine it. The Neanderthal hunting sites communicate across hundreds of millennia, telling us about a species that was our closest relative, our contemporary for thousands of years, and our equal in many ways that we are only now beginning to appreciate. And the hoaxes communicate something different, something uncomfortable. They tell us about ourselves, about our weaknesses and our blind spots, about the ways in which our hunger for wonder can be exploited. All of these communications have one thing in common: they were not intended for us. The Zapotec artist who carved the stone owl did not know that people from a distant future would gaze upon it. The Ice Age hunter who notched a bone with careful marks did not know that computational algorithms would one day analyze those marks. The Neanderthal who organized a horse drive did not know that millions of years later, a different kind of human would sift through the broken bones and reconstruct the event. And yet the messages arrived. They survived the passage of centuries and millennia. They endured the ravages of time, the weight of volcanic ash, the slow chemistry of decay. They waited patiently in the darkness underground until someone came along to find them, to interpret them, to give them voice again. This is the miracle of archaeology. Not just that we find things, but that there are things to find. Not just that we interpret the past, but that the past left something to be interpreted. The Earth is a vast archive, a repository of human experience stretching back to the very origins of our species. And every time we dig, every time we sift through the soil and brush the dirt from a bone or a potsherd or a carved stone, we are opening a letter that was written long ago and addressed without the writer's knowledge to us. We are still opening those letters. We are still reading them. And with each one, our understanding of the human story grows richer, deeper, and more astonishing. The story continues in part 2. We left you standing at the edge of a vast archive, an archive written not in ink but in stone and bone and soil, stretching back through the millennia to the very beginnings of human experience. In the first part of our journey, we uncovered sealed tombs and ancient graves. We stood before the rose-red facades of Petra. We climbed the hills of southeastern Turkey to witness the monument that shattered everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. And we held in our hands the carved bones of the Ice Age, objects that may represent the world's earliest attempts to record and transmit information. We watched the Neanderthals organize their great horse hunts and process their kills with a sophistication that humbles our old assumptions, and we confronted the hoaxes and forgeries that remind us how dangerously easy it is to believe what we want to believe. Now we continue, and if you thought the discoveries in the first part of our journey were extraordinary, prepare yourself, because what lies ahead is, if anything, even more astonishing. We are going to cross the burning sands of the Sinai Desert, where a Roman-era fortress the size of a small city once transformed one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth into a thriving hub of industry and commerce. We are going to dive beneath the green canopy of the Amazon rainforest, where a laser technology called LiDAR has revealed an entire civilization of interconnected cities that nobody knew existed. A civilization so large and so sophisticated that it is forcing scholars to completely rewrite the history of the Western Hemisphere. We are going to return to Gobekli Tepe and explore the deeper implications of what that extraordinary site tells us about the relationship between spirituality, social organization, and the birth of civilization. And we are going to examine in much greater depth the question of what all these discoveries, taken together, tell us about the true nature and capacity of the human mind across time. This is part 2 of our journey through the echoes of the forgotten world. And it begins in a place where almost nothing survives, where the sun strips the land bare, where the wind scours every surface, and where the past should have disappeared without a trace. And yet it did not. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. The Sinai Peninsula is one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. A roughly triangular wedge of land connecting the continents of Africa and Asia, it is bounded on the west by the Gulf of Suez and on the east by the Gulf of Aqaba, with the vast and pitiless expanse of the Sinai Desert occupying most of its interior. The summer temperatures here are ferocious, regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The annual rainfall is negligible, sometimes amounting to less than an inch per year. The landscape is a study in extremes: jagged granite mountains in the south, flat gravel plains in the north, valleys of sand and dust in between. Water, when it comes at all, comes as a flash flood, rushing down dry riverbeds in a torrent that vanishes almost as quickly as it appears, leaving the land as parched as before. For most of recorded history, the Sinai has been thought of as a place of passage rather than habitation. Armies crossed it on their way from Egypt to Canaan and back. Traders led camel caravans through its valleys, carrying spices and incense and luxury goods between the Mediterranean world and Arabia. Pilgrims crossed it on the way to holy mountains and sacred sites, but nobody, the conventional wisdom held, built anything significant in the Sinai. The environment was simply too hostile, too lacking in resources, too far from the rivers and coastal zones that supported large settled populations. The conventional wisdom was wrong. In recent years, archaeologists working in the northern Sinai have uncovered evidence of a massive Roman-era installation that defies everything we thought we knew about this region's history. The site, known in ancient texts by various names related to its position on the military road connecting Egypt to the Levant, is located in an area that today looks like nothing but sand and scrub. But beneath that deceptive surface lies the remains of one of the most ambitious construction projects ever undertaken in the ancient Near East. What the archaeologists found was not simply a fort. It was a fortress complex of enormous scale, a self-contained installation that occupied an area significantly larger than many ancient cities. The perimeter walls enclosed a space that would have accommodated not just soldiers but an entire military and civilian community, with barracks, administrative buildings, storage facilities, workshops, and residential quarters for the non-combatant population that supported the garrison. The scale of the construction was staggering. The walls were built from millions of mud bricks, each one manufactured on site from the alluvial clay of the region. The sheer quantity of bricks required to build walls of the height and thickness revealed by the excavations implies a manufacturing operation running at full capacity for years, perhaps for decades. Teams of workers would have been needed to mix the clay, form the bricks, allow them to dry in the desert sun, and transport them to the construction site. All of this in an environment where the summer heat alone represents a lethal hazard to unprotected workers. But the construction of the walls was only the beginning of what made this site remarkable. Because alongside the fortress, the Romans built something even more ambitious, a tree-lined avenue. Let that sink in for a moment. In the middle of the Sinai Desert, in one of the driest and most hostile environments on Earth, the Romans planted trees. Not a few trees scattered here and there, but a deliberate, planned avenue of trees lining the main road that led into and through the fortress complex. The evidence for these trees comes from the excavation of the pits in which they were planted, pits that were found in regular rows along the road, each one carefully dug and prepared to receive a sapling, each one originally surrounded by a low border of baked brick to help retain water. The trees themselves are long gone, but the pits remain, and their regular spacing and deliberate arrangement leave no doubt about their purpose. Roman military engineers and the workforce under their command, planted an avenue of trees in the Sinai Desert and maintained it over an extended period of time. To appreciate the significance of this, consider the logistics. Every tree planted in the Sinai requires water, not just a little water, but regular, sustained irrigation. In an environment that receives almost no rainfall, that water must be brought in from somewhere. The Romans solved this problem with an engineering system that matched, in its ambition and complexity, anything else they built throughout their vast empire. A network of wells, channels, cisterns, and possibly aqueducts was constructed to collect and distribute water across the site, ensuring that the trees, the crops, the animals, and the thousands of people living and working at the fortress had enough water to survive. The water management system at the Sinai fortress was not an improvisation. It was a sophisticated, carefully planned engineering achievement, designed by people who understood the hydrology of the desert, who knew where the water table could be reached and at what depth, who knew how to construct cisterns that would minimize evaporation in the blazing heat, and who knew how to build channels that would carry water efficiently from its source to where it was needed. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in the history of the Roman Empire. Wherever the Romans went, they brought their engineering with them. They built roads in the jungles of Britain, aqueducts in the hills of Spain, harbors in the shallows of North Africa. They did not adapt their ambitions to the environment. They adapted the environment to their ambitions. And in the Sinai, they did exactly this, transforming a barren and hostile desert into a functioning, productive, and even, in its own way, beautiful military installation. But the Sinai fortress was not only a military installation. The evidence uncovered by archaeologists suggests that it was also a significant industrial hub, a center of manufacturing and commerce that processed and distributed goods across the region. Among the facilities identified within the fortress complex are large-scale ovens and kilns, storage areas for raw materials and finished products, and workshops equipped for various forms of craft production. The scale of this industrial activity suggests that the fortress was not simply supporting itself. It was producing goods for export, for distribution along the military road, for consumption at other installations across the region. The road that ran through the fortress was one of the main arteries of the Roman East, connecting Egypt to the Levant and beyond, and the fortress sat astride this road like a bead on a necklace, a node in the network of trade and military activity that sustained the Eastern Empire. The presence of such an industrial hub in the Sinai raises important questions about the Roman economy and the logistics of supplying a military frontier. The eastern frontier of the Roman Empire was one of the longest and most contested in the ancient world, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Armenia, and keeping it supplied with men, weapons, food, and equipment was a perpetual logistical challenge. Installations like the Sinai fortress were part of the solution to this challenge, forward bases where supplies could be manufactured, stored, and distributed, reducing the need to transport everything from the more populated and productive regions of the Western Empire. The discovery of the fortress also illuminates a chapter of history that has been relatively underexplored. The Roman presence in the Sinai is documented in ancient texts, but the physical evidence has been sparse and often poorly preserved. The extreme climate of the desert is brutal on organic materials, and many sites have been damaged or destroyed by the combined forces of heat, wind, and occasional flash floods. The exceptional state of preservation of parts of the Sinai fortress, particularly the mud brick structures and the tree planting pits, is therefore all the more remarkable. Preservation in the desert is always a paradox. The very conditions that make the desert so hostile to life, the low humidity, the intense solar radiation, The absence of the biological processes that accelerate decay in more temperate environments can also preserve organic and inorganic materials with extraordinary fidelity. Wood, leather, textiles, and papyrus that would rot within years in a rainforest can survive for centuries, even millennia, in the desert. The Sinai fortress has benefited from this preservative effect, allowing archaeologists to recover details that would have been lost in almost any other environment. Among the details recovered are traces of the daily life of the people who lived and worked at the fortress. The layout of the barracks suggests the organization of the garrison. The distribution of cooking installations, ovens, and hearths indicates where the soldiers and workers ate and how their food was prepared. The positioning of the storage facilities relative to the workshops and the road reveals something about the logistics of production and distribution. And the tree-lined avenue with its regular spacing and its carefully constructed planting pits speaks of an intention not just to make the fortress functional, but to make it habitable, even pleasant, for the people who were stationed there far from the more comfortable regions of the empire. This attention to the quality of life of military personnel is a consistent feature of Roman military architecture. Roman fortresses throughout the empire were not simply functional installations. They were in many ways miniature versions of Roman cities, with amenities like baths, temples, markets, and administrative buildings that made them recognizable as Roman spaces regardless of where in the empire they were located. The Sinai fortress with its tree-lined avenue appears to have embodied this same ethos, the determination to impose Roman order, Roman comfort, and Roman aesthetics even on one of the most inhospitable environments the empire ever occupied. The Sinai fortress is not simply an archaeological site. It is a testament to human determination, to the capacity of organized societies to overcome environmental obstacles that seem, on the surface, insurmountable. The Romans who built this fortress did not look at the desert and see an obstacle. They looked at it and saw a problem to be solved, a challenge to be met with engineering and organization and the sheer force of will that characterized their civilization at its height. And they solved it. They built their fortress, planted their trees, dug their wells, manufactured their goods, and maintained their road across the burning sands of the Sinai for centuries. The trees are gone now, the soldiers are gone, the administrators and the craftspeople and the families who lived in the shadows of the great walls are gone. But the pits where the trees were planted are still there, precise and regular in their spacing, still telling the story of the day someone decided to plant an avenue of trees in the middle of a desert and found a way to make them grow. From the scorching aridity of the Sinai, our journey now takes us to the opposite extreme, a landscape of overwhelming abundance, a world of green so dense and so deep that for centuries it defeated every attempt to see what lay within it. We are going to the Amazon. The Amazon rainforest is the largest tropical rainforest on Earth, covering an area of approximately 2.5 million square miles across 9 countries. It contains more species of plants, animals, and insects than any other ecosystem on the planet. Its canopy, when seen from above, is a seamless green blanket stretching to every horizon, broken only by the silver threads of rivers and the occasional dark gash of a burned clearing. From the air, the Amazon appears to be the last true wilderness, a place where nature reigns supreme and human civilization has made only the shallowest of impressions. For most of the 20th century, this appearance was taken at face value. Scholars who studied the Amazon generally concluded that its environment was simply too challenging for the development of complex societies. The soils of the Amazon, despite the lushness of the vegetation they support, are actually quite poor in nutrients. The nutrients in a tropical rainforest are locked up in the living organisms, in the trees and the plants and the animals, not in the soil itself. This is why clearing a rainforest for agriculture produces only a few years of productive farming before the soil is exhausted. With such poor agricultural potential, the conventional wisdom held, the Amazon could only have supported small, mobile, low-density populations of hunter-gatherers and simple slash-and-burn farmers. The conventional wisdom, as we have seen before, was wrong. Spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The revolution in our understanding of pre-Columbian Amazonia began with a series of discoveries made possible by a technology that has transformed archaeology in the 21st century. That technology is LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. LiDAR works by firing pulses of laser light from an aircraft and measuring the time it takes for those pulses to bounce back from the surface below. By firing millions of pulses per second and processing the resulting data, researchers can create extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of the landscape, maps that capture every bump and depression, every ridge and valley, every man-made earthwork and natural feature. The crucial advantage of LiDAR for Amazonian archaeology is that it can see through vegetation. The laser pulses that hit leaves and branches are filtered out of the data, while the pulses that penetrate the canopy and reach the ground are retained. The result is a map of the ground surface beneath the forest, a map that is as detailed and as accurate as if the trees did not exist. For the first time, researchers could look at the Amazon not as it appears today, a wall of impenetrable green, but as it was before the forest grew back over the ruins of whatever lay beneath. What they found beneath the Amazon canopy was beyond anything anyone had expected. Hidden under the trees, invisible to the eye but perfectly visible to the lasers, were the remains of a vast network of ancient settlements, connected by roads, organized around central plazas, surrounded by agricultural fields and water management systems. These were not small villages. They were cities, dozens of them, some covering areas of several square miles, interconnected by raised causeways that stretched for miles through the forest. The civilization responsible for these settlements has been linked by researchers to a culture known as the Kasarab, who lived in the Bolivian Amazon between approximately 500 and 1400 years of the Common Era. The Kasarab people were already known from archaeological investigations that had uncovered distinctive pottery and earthworks in various parts of the region. But the LiDAR surveys revealed the true extent and sophistication of their civilization in a way that ground-level excavation alone could never have done. The Kasarab settlements were not randomly distributed across the landscape. They were organized in a hierarchical network, with large urban centers at the top of the hierarchy and smaller settlements arranged around them. The urban centers were connected to each other and to the smaller settlements by a system of raised roads, earthen causeways elevated above the level of the surrounding land. These causeways were wide enough for multiple people to travel abreast, and they were straight, maintained over long distances with a precision that implies careful surveying and sustained maintenance. The presence of raised roads is itself significant. Roads are built when there is regular traffic between places, when the movement of people and goods is frequent and predictable enough to justify the investment of labor required to construct and maintain a proper road. The Kasarab road network implies a society in which trade, communication, and the movement of people were important and ongoing activities, a society that was integrated and interconnected rather than fragmented into isolated villages with no regular contact. At the centers of the largest settlements, LiDAR revealed the outlines of monumental structures, large earthen platforms and mounds that would have served as the foundations for important buildings, temples, administrative centers, or residences for the elite. These platforms were surrounded by plazas, open spaces that would have served as gathering places for markets, ceremonies, and other communal activities. The entire layout, with its central plaza, its surrounding platforms, and its roads radiating outward to smaller settlements, is consistent with the urban organization seen in other ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. The water management infrastructure of the Kasarab civilization was equally impressive. The Amazon basin experiences dramatic seasonal flooding. During the wet season, vast areas of low-lying land are inundated by the rising waters of the rivers and their tributaries. This flooding is both a resource and a challenge. It deposits nutrient-rich sediments on the floodplains, creating fertile agricultural land, but it also threatens settlements and disrupts transportation. Managing this flood cycle, controlling when and where water flows, was a crucial engineering challenge for any civilization attempting to build permanent settlements in the Amazon. The Kasarab people met this challenge with a sophisticated system of earthworks. LiDAR revealed an extensive network of canals, reservoirs, check dams, and drainage channels that covered much of the settled area. This system served multiple purposes simultaneously. It controlled flooding by channeling excess water away from settled areas into storage reservoirs. It provided irrigation during the dry season when water became scarce. It created fish ponds, which would have been an important source of protein. And it managed the movement of water through the landscape in ways that enhanced the productivity of the agricultural land. The engineering of this water management system required a detailed understanding of the hydrology of the region. The builders had to know how the rivers rose and fell with the seasons, where the water naturally flowed, where it pooled, where it could be diverted. They had to design a system that worked with the natural patterns of water movement rather than against them. And they had to maintain that system over centuries, repairing breaches, clearing blockages, adjusting the system as conditions changed. This is not the work of a primitive society. This is the work of a civilization, a society with the organization, the knowledge, the labor force, and the institutional memory to undertake and sustain complex, multi-generational engineering projects. The discovery of the Kasserab urban network has profound implications for our understanding of pre-Columbian history. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been portrayed, in both popular and scholarly discourse, as living in small, isolated, technologically simple communities, untouched by the currents of history that shaped civilizations elsewhere. This portrayal was always partly a projection, a reflection of the biases of those doing the portraying rather than an accurate account of the reality, but it was also, to some extent, based on a genuine lack of evidence. The forest had hidden the cities, the trees had swallowed the roads, the rivers had eroded the earthworks, and without LiDAR there was no way to see through the green canopy to the civilization that lay beneath. Now that civilization is visible, and its visibility forces us to reckon with what was lost. When the population of the Amazon collapsed in the centuries following European contact, devastated by epidemic diseases to which they had no immunity, it was not just people who died. It was a civilization, an urban civilization, a civilization with cities, roads, water systems, markets, and monuments. A civilization that had spent centuries transforming one of the most challenging environments on Earth into a productive, organized, and apparently thriving human habitat. The loss of this civilization is incalculable, not just in human terms, though the human loss was catastrophic, but in terms of knowledge. The Kasserab people and their descendants possessed detailed knowledge of the Amazon ecosystem, knowledge accumulated over centuries of close observation and interaction. They knew which plants could be cultivated and which could not. They knew how to manage the flood cycle to maximize agricultural productivity. They knew how to build cities in the rainforest without destroying it. They knew things about living sustainably in a tropical ecosystem that we are only now beginning to rediscover through painstaking scientific research. Much of that knowledge died with its possessors, but the cities remain, buried under the forest, waiting for the lasers to find them and give them back their shape and their scale. Every new LiDAR survey reveals more settlements, more roads, more earthworks. The Kasserab urban network is already far larger than anyone imagined, and researchers believe that the full extent of pre-Columbian settlement in the Amazon has still not been determined. There may be hundreds more settlements out there, waiting to be discovered, each one adding to our understanding of a civilization that was hiding in plain sight, concealed not by the desert or the volcanic ash or the accumulated debris of centuries, but by life itself, by the inexorable growth of the forest that reclaimed its territory when the people who had shaped it were gone. The Amazon teaches us something that complements the lessons of all the other sites we have visited. It teaches us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For centuries, we looked at the Amazon and saw nothing, no cities, no roads, no monuments, and we concluded that there was nothing there. We were wrong. The evidence was there all along. We simply lacked the tools to see it. The LiDAR surveys are not a discovery of something new. They are a recovery of something old, something that was always there, just waiting for us to find a way to look. This is a lesson that applies far beyond the Amazon. Everywhere we look in the archaeological record, the absence of evidence reflects the limits of our methods and our tools, not the limits of what existed. Every technological advance in archaeology, from ground-penetrating radar to chemical analysis of residues to isotopic dating to DNA sequencing, has expanded the range of what we can see and what we can know. And every expansion of what we can see has revealed more complexity, more sophistication, more humanity in the past than we previously suspected. The past is not simpler than the present, it is not more primitive, it is not less human. It is different, yes, organized around different technologies and different social structures and different cosmologies, but it is fully human in all its messiness and ambition and creativity and complexity. And the more clearly we can see it, the more we are reminded that the capacity for civilization, for sophisticated organized social life, is not something that emerged recently. It is something that has been part of our species since the very beginning. That capacity and the forces that drive it brings us back to Gobekli Tepe. We introduced this extraordinary site in the first part of our journey, focusing on its age and its implication that complex ritual life predated agriculture. Now we want to go deeper. We want to explore what Gobekli Tepe reveals about the social and psychological forces that drive human beings to create, to build, to gather together in shared purpose. The question that Gobekli Tepe poses most urgently is not simply how did they build it. The how, while impressive, can be answered in principle by reference to human muscle, stone tools, and organized labor. The more interesting question is why. Why did a group of hunter-gatherers, living a mobile and materially simple lifestyle, invest enormous amounts of time and energy in building a monumental stone complex on a hilltop? What did they get out of it? What need did it fulfill that was so powerful and so urgent that it justified the sacrifice of time and resources that the construction required? To answer this question, we need to think about the social life of hunter-gatherers. In most reconstructions of Paleolithic and early Neolithic social life, the basic unit of society is the band, a small group of closely related individuals, typically no more than a few dozen people, who move through a territory together, sharing food, protecting each other from danger, and cooperating in the daily tasks of survival. Bands are mobile because the resources they depend on, game animals and wild plants, are distributed across a wide area and are not consistently available in any one location. The band is a highly effective social unit for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It is small enough to move quickly and efficiently. It is large enough to pool the diverse skills and knowledge needed for survival. And it is bound together by kinship and by the daily intimacy of shared life. But the band also has limitations. It is a small world. The number of people you interact with regularly is small. The range of ideas and experiences available to you is limited. And there is a constant risk that the band will become isolated, cut off from the broader human community that provides access to mates, to new information, to allies in times of crisis, and to the simple psychological sustenance of knowing that you are part of something larger than your immediate group. Many hunter-gatherer societies address this limitation through periodic gatherings, occasions when multiple bands come together in a shared location for activities that transcend the everyday concerns of survival. These gatherings serve multiple functions. They are occasions for finding mates, for exchanging genetic material between groups and avoiding the genetic dangers of inbreeding. They are occasions for exchanging information, for sharing knowledge about game movements, plant availability, water sources, and other resources. They are occasions for resolving disputes between groups, for establishing and reinforcing alliances, and for defining and reaffirming shared identity. And critically, they are occasions for ritual, for ceremony, for the collective performance of shared beliefs about the nature of the world and the relationship between the human community and the supernatural forces that govern it. This is where Gobekli Tepe comes in. The site was almost certainly a gathering place, a location to which multiple bands from a wide geographic area came together periodically for purposes that were social, economic, and above all spiritual. The stone circles were the physical expression of this gathering function, permanent structures that marked the site as special, as sacred, as a place set apart from the everyday world. The construction of the stone circles served the gathering function in a particularly powerful way. The act of building together, of working alongside people from other groups toward a shared goal, is one of the most effective ways of creating social bonds. When you have sweated and strained alongside someone to move a massive stone pillar, you feel a connection to them that transcends the boundaries of your own band. You have invested in something together. You have created something together. And that shared creation becomes a symbol of your shared identity, a physical embodiment of the bonds between you. This is why great building projects have been such a consistent feature of complex societies throughout history. The pyramid, the cathedral, the mosque, the Great Wall, these structures are not just functional. They are social technologies, instruments for creating and reinforcing the bonds that hold large communities together. Gobekli Tepe was, in this sense, the world's first large-scale social technology, a stone monument to the human need for community. But there is another dimension to Gobekli Tepe that goes beyond the social. It is the spiritual dimension, the sense that the site was not merely a meeting place but a sacred place, a place where the boundary between the human world and the divine or supernatural world was unusually thin. The elaborate carvings on the pillars speak to this dimension. The animals depicted on the pillars are not realistic portraits of the creatures the builders hunted and ate. They are stylized, symbolic representations, animals charged with meaning, animals that carry a significance beyond their physical reality. The fox, the lion, the vulture, the scorpion, each of these creatures would have had a place in the symbolic universe of the people who carved them, a set of associations and meanings that made them appropriate subjects for a sacred space. The two central pillars of each circle, larger than the surrounding pillars and bearing carved arms and hands, suggest that these central figures were not merely decorative but were understood as presences, as beings with agency and intention. Whether they were ancestors, deities, totemic spirits, or something else entirely, they were conceived as entities that deserved to be acknowledged and honored in the construction and decoration of the site. The spiritual significance of Göbekli Tepe is also suggested by the way the site was used over time. The stone circles were not built all at once. They were built in stages over a period of centuries, with new circles being added as the older ones were filled in and buried. This suggests a continuous tradition of construction and use, a tradition that was maintained across many generations, and that presumably carried with it a continuous set of beliefs and practices. The act of burying the older circles, rather than simply demolishing them or allowing them to fall into disrepair, is particularly telling. It suggests that the older structures retained their sacredness even after they were no longer actively used, that they were not simply obsolete buildings to be cleared away, but hallowed spaces to be honored through careful interment. This attitude toward old sacred structures is familiar from many ancient cultures, where the burial or demolition of a sacred building was itself a ritual act, performed with care and deliberation. All of this suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not simply a building project. It was an ongoing spiritual enterprise, a centuries-long commitment to maintaining and expanding a sacred space that served the deepest needs of the communities that built and used it. And it suggests that these needs, the need for ritual, for shared symbolic expression, for a sacred place where the community could come together and affirm its identity and its relationship with the supernatural, are not products of civilization. They are preconditions for it. This is the deepest lesson of Göbekli Tepe. Not that hunter-gatherers were smarter or more capable than we thought, though they were. Not that the timeline of civilization needs to be revised, though it does. The deepest lesson is that the spiritual impulse, the desire to reach beyond the material world and touch something transcendent, is not a luxury that sophisticated societies indulge in after their material needs are met. It is a fundamental human drive, present from the very beginning, powerful enough to motivate the construction of massive stone monuments by people who had, by any material measure, very little to spare. This insight has important implications for how we understand civilization. We tend to think of civilization as primarily a material phenomenon, a matter of agriculture, technology, cities, and economic systems. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that civilization is at least as much a spiritual phenomenon, driven by the need for shared meaning, shared identity, and shared relationship with the sacred. The material achievements of civilization, the surpluses and the cities and the writing systems, are not the cause of civilization. They are its products, the byproducts of the social and spiritual organization that the need for shared meaning creates. If this is correct, then the story of human civilization begins not with the first planted grain, but with the first carved stone, not with the first harvest, but with the first ceremony, not with the first city, but with the first gathering around a shared symbol of the sacred. And that story is far older, far deeper, and far more human than we ever imagined. The thread that connects Göbekli Tepe to all the other sites we have visited, from the Zapotec tomb to the Bell Graves, from the hidden cities of the Amazon to the industrial fortress of the Sinai, is the thread of human intentionality. These are not natural formations. They are not accidents. They are the products of deliberate human choices, choices made by people who had goals and desires and beliefs that guided their actions. Understanding those choices, those goals, those desires is the ultimate aim of archaeology, and it is an aim that is never fully achieved because the people who made those choices are long dead and the evidence they left behind is always incomplete. We work with fragments. We reconstruct wholes from parts, narratives from shards, lives from bones. But there is another dimension to the human story that we have not yet fully explored, a dimension that emerges when we look not at individual sites or individual discoveries, but at the pattern that all these discoveries, taken together, begin to reveal. And that dimension is the universality of certain human behaviors and certain human needs. Consider what we have seen. In Mexico, people 1,400 years ago carved a stone owl to guard their dead. The same country, people 3,500 years ago dug elaborate underground chambers for their dead. In Jordan, people 2,000 years ago buried 12 individuals in a sacred location with a ritual chalice. In Turkey, people 12,000 years ago built stone circles decorated with animal carvings for purposes that were almost certainly spiritual. The specifics differ. The cultures are different, the time periods are different, the materials are different, the symbols are different. But the underlying behavior is the same. In every case, people were investing significant resources, time, labor, materials, in activities that went beyond the immediate demands of survival. In every case, they were expressing beliefs about death, about the sacred, about the relationship between the living and the dead and the divine. In every case, they were creating shared symbols and shared spaces that bound their communities together. This universality is one of the most important things that archaeology reveals about human nature. We are not a species defined primarily by our material needs. We are a species defined primarily by our meaning-making, our need to understand the world in which we live, to locate ourselves within it, to connect with others around shared beliefs and shared experiences, and to reach beyond the boundaries of the material world towards something that we sense, however dimly, lies beyond it. This meaning-making impulse is not a product of civilization. It does not appear suddenly at some point in history when human beings became sophisticated enough to indulge in the luxury of philosophy and religion. It is, as Gobekli Tepe demonstrates, at least 12,000 years old. As the Ice Age bone carvings suggest, it may be 45,000 years old or more. As the evidence from Neanderthal burial sites suggests, it may predate our own species entirely. We did not invent meaning-making, we inherited it. And every ancient tomb, every carved stone, every notched bone, every city hidden under the forest is a testament to that inheritance, a proof that the desire to make sense of the world and to share that sense with others has been part of what it means to be human for as long as there have been humans. This recognition that the meaning-making impulse is universal and ancient also helps us understand the hoaxes we examined in the first part of our journey. The Cardiff giant, the Vinland map, the Archaeoraptor. Why did these hoaxes succeed, even temporarily? Why did intelligent, educated people believe in them? The answer is not simply that people are gullible, though that is part of the story. The deeper answer is that people want meaning. They want the world to be more interesting, more mysterious, more filled with wonder than it appears on the surface. The Cardiff giant told people that giants had once walked the earth, that the mythological world was real, that the boundary between legend and history was thinner than we thought. The Vinland map told people that their preferred historical narrative was correct, that history had the shape they wanted it to have. The Archaeoraptor told scientists that the missing link they sought had been found, that the evolutionary story was even more complete than they had imagined. In each case, the hoax worked because it offered something that people deeply desired. Not just information, not just evidence, but meaning. A story that made the world feel more coherent, more interesting, more filled with the kind of significance that we crave. This is a double-edged insight. On one hand, it explains our vulnerability to deception. When we want something to be true, we are less likely to scrutinize the evidence carefully. We are more likely to accept claims uncritically, to overlook inconsistencies, to dismiss doubts. The desire for meaning can override the discipline of skepticism. On the other hand, the same desire for meaning that makes us vulnerable to hoaxes is what drives genuine discovery. It is what sends archaeologists to remote and inhospitable locations in search of the traces of lost civilizations. It is what keeps scientists working for years on problems that others have given up on. It is what drives the determination to look beneath the surface of the obvious, to push past the conventional wisdom, to ask the questions that nobody else has thought to ask. The desire for meaning is the engine of inquiry. It is what makes us dig and question and analyze and debate. And when it is disciplined by rigorous methods and honest skepticism, it produces something remarkable. It produces knowledge. Real, verified, robust knowledge about the world and about ourselves. The best archaeology is the product of this combination, desire and discipline working together. The desire to know what lies beneath the surface of the earth, disciplined by the careful, patient methods of excavation, analysis, and interpretation. The desire to understand who our ancestors were and what they believed, disciplined by the willingness to accept what the evidence actually shows rather than what we want it to show. This combination does not guarantee perfect results. Mistakes are made, interpretations are revised, new evidence overturns old conclusions. But over time, through the accumulation of careful observations and rigorous analysis, a picture emerges. Not a complete picture, not a final picture, but a picture that is more accurate and more detailed than what came before, a picture that keeps being refined and expanded with every new discovery. The refinement of our picture of the past brings us, at last, to a broader reflection on what all the discoveries we have examined in this documentary tell us about the trajectory of human history and the nature of human potential. We began with tombs, and there is something appropriate about that beginning, because tombs are in a sense the most fundamental expression of what makes us human. Every other animal on earth lives and dies without marking its passing. The body falls, the elements reclaim it, and within a short time there is nothing to show that the creature ever existed. But humans mark their passing. We bury our dead, we mark the graves, we create monuments, we inscribe the names and the faces and the stories of those who have died so that they will not be forgotten. This impulse to remember, to preserve, to mark the passing of the individual against the indifference of time is uniquely human, and it is ancient, older than writing. Older than agriculture, older than civilization as we normally define it. The Neanderthals buried their dead. The Ice Age hunters carved their bones with what may be coded information. The builders of Göbekli Tepe created monuments that have lasted 12,000 years. The Zapotec artist carved a stone owl to guard a tomb for 14 centuries. All of these acts share a common root. They are all forms of resistance against forgetting. They are all ways of insisting that the individual, the community, the experience, the belief matters, that it deserves to be preserved, to be honored, to endure beyond the brief moment of its living. This resistance against forgetting is, in many ways, the foundation of civilization. Writing was invented not primarily as a means of artistic expression or philosophical reflection, but as a practical tool for keeping records, for preserving information across time and across the limitations of individual memory. The first temples were built not primarily as aesthetic achievements, but as institutional structures, permanent physical expressions of beliefs and practices that needed to be maintained and transmitted from one generation to the next. The first cities were not just concentrations of population, but archives, places where the accumulated knowledge and experience of the community was concentrated and preserved. Civilization, in this light, is humanity's most elaborate system for remembering. It is the sum total of all the tools and institutions and practices we have developed to ensure that what we know, what we believe, what we have experienced, survives beyond the lifetime of any individual and accumulates, generation by generation, into the vast and extraordinary body of knowledge and culture that defines our species. The ancient discoveries we have examined in this documentary are all chapters in this story of accumulation. The Zapotec owl and the bell graves and the Petra tomb and the Sinai fortress and the Amazon cities, all of these are nodes in the network of human memory, places where something was preserved that might otherwise have been lost, places where the thread of human experience was kept alive across the centuries and millennia. And the fact that we can now find these places, open these tombs, read these bones, map these cities beneath the forest, is itself a testament to the power of the civilizational project. We can recover the past, however imperfectly, because we have developed the tools to do so. The tools of archaeology, of chemistry, of genetics, of remote sensing, of computational analysis are themselves products of the same impulse to know, to understand, to remember that motivated the building of the first stone circles and the digging of the first graves. We are, in a very real sense, the inheritors of everything we have been examining. The cognitive abilities that allowed Ice Age hunters to create coded notation systems are the same abilities we use to develop algorithms to decode those systems. The organizational capacity that allowed the Kasarab people to build cities in the Amazon is the same capacity we use to organize the research teams and funding structures and institutional frameworks that allow us to find those cities with LiDAR. The spiritual impulse that drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe to raise their stone circles is the same impulse that drives us to search for meaning in the past. We are not separate from the ancient world. We are its continuation. Every discovery we make about the past is, in a sense, a discovery about ourselves, about where our capacities come from, about how deep our roots go, about how long and how consistently the human story has been running. The story of the Sinai fortress, with its tree-lined avenue in the desert, raises a question that applies to all the sites we have visited. What do these places tell us about the relationship between human beings and the environments in which they live? The conventional answer to this question, at least in much of the modern period, has been a story of domination and exploitation. Human beings, the story goes, are unique among animals in their ability to transform the natural environment to suit their needs. We clear forests, drain wetlands, irrigate deserts, mine mountains, redirect rivers. We impose our will on nature, bending it to our purposes. And this capacity for environmental transformation is both our greatest achievement and our greatest liability. The ancient evidence we have examined offers a more nuanced picture. Yes, the Romans transformed the Sinai desert, building a fortress and planting trees in an environment that seemed to preclude both. Yes, the Kasarab people transformed the Amazon floodplain, constructing an extensive network of cities, roads, and water management systems in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Yes, the Zapotecs and the Nabateans and the builders of Göbekli Tepe all modified their environments to create the spaces they needed for their buildings and their ceremonies. But in each case, the transformation was not simply an imposition of human will on a passive and indifferent natural world. It was a dialogue, a negotiation between human desires and environmental realities. The Romans planted trees in the Sinai, but they did so using a sophisticated understanding of desert hydrology, working with the available water rather than ignoring it. The Kasarab built their cities in the Amazon, but they did so using the flooding and the soil and the rivers as resources rather than obstacles, creating a system of water management that enhanced rather than destroyed the productivity of the landscape. The builders of Gobekli Tepe chose their hilltop with care, selecting a location that offered both the stone they needed and the visibility and prominence appropriate for a sacred site. In each case, the ancient builders were not ignorant of their environment. They were deeply knowledgeable about it, intimately familiar with its rhythms and its resources and its constraints, and they used that knowledge not to override the environment but to work within it, to find the spaces where human ingenuity and environmental reality could meet and produce something new. This is a lesson that resonates powerfully with the challenges of our own time. The question of how human civilization can sustain itself within the constraints of the natural world is one of the most urgent questions of our era, and the ancient evidence suggests that this question is not new. It has been a central challenge for human societies throughout history. And the most successful societies, measured by their longevity and their internal coherence, have been those that found ways to meet this challenge through deep knowledge, careful management, and a relationship with the natural world that was cooperative rather than purely exploitative. The Kasarab cities of the Amazon endured for nearly 1,000 years. They were not simply carved out of the forest but integrated with it, shaped by an understanding of the ecosystem that allowed them to persist without destroying the resource base on which they depended. The Roman fortress in the Sinai survived for centuries, sustained by a water management system that made productive use of a scarce resource without depleting it. These are not perfect models for our own situation, but they are instructive ones. They remind us that the challenge of living sustainably within environmental constraints is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest challenges of human civilization, and it has been met, more or less successfully, by many societies throughout history. As we approach the conclusion of our journey, let us take a moment to step back and consider the broad sweep of what we have seen. We have moved from 1,400 years ago to 12,000 years ago. We have visited Mexico and Jordan and Turkey and Egypt and the Amazon. We have encountered Zapotec and Nabatean and Roman and Kasarab and Neolithic cultures. We have examined bones and stones and maps and cities. We have explored the human capacity for construction and for deception, for ritual and for commerce, for art and for engineering. And throughout all of this, one theme has emerged with particular force and consistency. It is the theme of underestimation. Again and again, we have found that ancient peoples were more capable, more sophisticated, more cognitively and culturally complex than our previous understanding gave them credit for. The Zapotec artists who created the painted tomb at San Pablo were masters of their craft. The bell tomb builders of the Valley of Mexico were skilled engineers with a sophisticated understanding of funerary architecture. The Nabateans who buried 12 individuals in front of the treasury were participants in a rich and complex religious and cultural life. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were organizing and executing large-scale construction projects that required capabilities we did not believe they possessed. The Kasarab people were building cities in the Amazon that we did not know existed. The Ice Age hunters were developing coding systems that we are only now beginning to decode. And the Neanderthals were hunting and processing food with a sophistication that we spent decades refusing to credit them with. In every case, the mistake was the same. We looked at ancient peoples through the lens of our own assumptions about what was possible in the past, assumptions shaped by a narrative of linear progress from primitive to sophisticated. And in every case, the evidence forced us to revise those assumptions, to acknowledge that the past was more complex, more capable, and more human than we had supposed. This is not a trivial lesson. It has real implications for how we think about human potential, about the relationship between material conditions and cognitive achievement, and about the pace and nature of cultural development. If people 12,000 years ago could build Gobekli Tepe, if people 45,000 years ago could develop coded notation systems, if people living in the Amazon could build cities without the benefit of writing or metal tools or wheeled transport, then the conventional narrative of progress, which ties cognitive achievement to technological complexity, is fundamentally flawed. Cognitive achievement does not require advanced technology. It requires a brain, and our brains have been essentially the same for at least 300,000 years. Every human being who has ever lived, from the hunter-gatherer who built the first stone circle at Gobekli Tepe to the scientist who analyzed the LiDAR data over the Amazon, possessed fundamentally the same cognitive equipment. The differences in what they achieved are differences not in capacity but in accumulated knowledge, in the resources available to them, and in the particular challenges and opportunities that their environments presented. This should inspire both humility and wonder. Humility, because it reminds us that the achievements we pride ourselves on are not the products of superior intelligence, but of superior inheritance. We stand on the shoulders of every generation that came before us, benefiting from the accumulated knowledge and experience that they built up and passed down. And wonder, because it reminds us of the extraordinary things that human beings have achieved in every era and every environment, with whatever tools and materials were available to them. The stone owl at San Pablo, the bell graves sealed by volcanic fire, the 12 skeletons and the ceramic chalice beneath the treasury of Petra, the T-shaped pillars of Gobekli Tepe, the laser-revealed cities of the Amazon, the notched bones of the Ice Age, the organized hunting grounds of the Neanderthals, all of these are testaments to human capacity. They are proof that the impulse to build, to create, to organize, to understand, to remember is not a product of civilization. It is its cause. There is one more discovery we must discuss before we conclude our journey. It is a discovery that ties together many of the threads we have been following, a discovery that speaks simultaneously to the question of human capability, to the relationship between ancient peoples and their environments, and to the enduring power of the spiritual impulse to drive human achievement. We return for the last time to Gobekli Tepe. Or rather, we move outward from Gobekli Tepe, to think about what the site represents in the broader context of the Neolithic Revolution and the transformation of human society that occurred in the period between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural ones, is often presented as a single, relatively rapid event, a shift that occurred when human beings discovered that they could cultivate plants and domesticate animals, and that this discovery quickly led to settled life, surplus production, population growth, and eventually civilization. This presentation is a dramatic oversimplification, but it has been remarkably persistent in both popular and scholarly accounts of human prehistory. The reality, as Gobekli Tepe and the broader archaeological record reveal, was far more complex. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming was not a single event, but a long, multi-stage, geographically variable process that unfolded over thousands of years and involved many different societies following many different paths. Some societies adopted agriculture early and enthusiastically. Others resisted it, continuing to hunt and gather long after their neighbors had settled into farming villages. Some societies adopted elements of agriculture, cultivating some plants while continuing to hunt wild game, without ever making the full transition to a fully agricultural lifestyle. What drove this transition, where and when it occurred, is still debated, but Gobekli Tepe offers a new perspective on the question. If the site was indeed a gathering place for multiple hunter-gatherer groups, a place where people came together for ritual and social purposes, then it would have created a demand for food. Feeding the hundreds or thousands of people who gathered at the site for ceremonies would have required the regular production of significant quantities of food, more than could be easily obtained through hunting and gathering in the immediate vicinity. This demand may have been one of the factors that drove experimentation with plant cultivation in the region. The wild grasses that grow naturally in the area around Gobekli Tepe include the ancestors of wheat and barley, the primary cereal crops of the ancient Near East. If the people who gathered at the site began to cultivate these grasses to ensure a reliable food supply for their ceremonies, they would have been taking one of the first steps toward agriculture, not out of a desire to settle down or to produce surplus, but out of a desire to maintain their ritual life. This is a radical inversion of the traditional narrative. In the conventional account, farming leads to temples. In the Gobekli Tepe account, temples lead to farming. The spiritual drives the material. The desire for ritual precedes and perhaps causes the invention of agriculture. This hypothesis has been developed in detail by several researchers and remains the subject of active debate. It is not universally accepted, and there are aspects of the archaeological record that complicate it. But the basic insight that the spiritual and social dimensions of human life are not secondary to the material, but may in fact drive material change, is compelling and well supported by the evidence. It is a perspective that transforms the way we understand the Neolithic Revolution. Instead of seeing it as primarily an economic transformation, a shift in the food production strategy of early human societies, we can see it as primarily a social and spiritual transformation, a shift in the way human beings organized their communities and expressed their beliefs about the world. The economic aspects of the revolution, the farming, the herding, the surpluses, and the settlements, were the means by which this social and spiritual transformation was sustained and expanded. But the transformation itself was driven by the same impulses that drove the building of Göbekli Tepe, the need for shared meaning, shared identity, and shared relationship with the sacred. And so we come at last to the end of our journey. We have traveled far in space and in time. We have visited tombs and temples, fortresses and cities, hunting grounds and sacred hilltops. We have examined bones and stones, maps and carvings, laser-generated images of cities hidden under jungle canopies, and chemical analyses of inks on medieval parchment. We have met Zapotec artists and Nabatean priests, Roman engineers and Amazon city builders, Ice Age notation keepers and Neanderthal hunters. We have encountered both the extraordinary achievements of our ancestors and the extraordinary things we have almost refused to know about them, the underestimations, the dismissals, the comfortable assumptions that the past was simpler than the present. Every discovery we have examined has been a correction. Not just a correction of a specific historical claim, not just a revision of a particular archaeological interpretation, but a correction of a broader and more fundamental error. The error of underestimating what human beings are capable of, in any era, under any conditions, with any set of tools. The stone owl at San Pablo tells us that artistic mastery and spiritual depth are not modern inventions. The bell graves of the Valley of Mexico tell us that the desire to honor the dead with care and intention goes back to the very beginnings of settled life in the region. The hidden tomb at Petra tells us that even the most famous monuments in the world still hold secrets, still have stories they have not yet told. Göbekli Tepe tells us that the spiritual impulse, the need for ritual and shared meaning, is not a byproduct of civilization, but one of its primary causes. The Sinai fortress tells us that the determination to impose order on chaos, to build and maintain and sustain in the face of a hostile environment, is one of the most consistent and powerful forces in human history. The Amazon cities tell us that civilizations we did not know existed were building urban networks of stunning sophistication in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Ice Age bones tell us that the cognitive tools of abstract thinking and symbolic representation are at least 45,000 years old, and the Neanderthals tell us that intelligence and ingenuity are not the exclusive property of our own species or our own era. Each of these corrections expands our understanding. Each one pushes back the horizon of human achievement, revealing that the story of our species is longer, richer, and more varied than we ever imagined. Each one reminds us that the past was not a period of waiting, of marking time until civilization arrived to give it meaning. It was full in every moment and every place of people doing remarkable things, building, creating, organizing, believing, caring for their dead, hunting together, planting trees in deserts, building cities under jungles, carving information into bones, raising stones toward the sky. They were us, and we are them. The continuity is unbroken, however many generations separate us from the stone owl in San Pablo or the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe. We are the latest chapter in a story that began long before any of us can remember, a story that has been running without interruption through all the ages of the world, and the story is not finished. Right now, somewhere in the world, an archaeologist is brushing soil from an object that nobody has touched in 1,000 years. A LiDAR survey is producing data that will reveal the outlines of a city that nobody knew existed. A DNA analysis is tracing the migrations of a population across thousands of miles and thousands of years. A computational algorithm is finding patterns in ancient marks that nobody has recognized as patterns before. Every day, the past yields new secrets. Every day, our understanding of who we are and where we came from grows richer and more complex. And every day, the echoes of the forgotten world grow a little louder, a little clearer, a little closer to the voice of a living past that has been speaking to us always, if only we know how to listen. The stone owl still watches. The bell-shaped tombs still hold their careful dead. The great pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stand in their circles on the hilltop. The laser-revealed cities of the Amazon still extend their networks of roads and plazas and water channels through the forest. The ancient bones, with their coded marks, still carry their messages forward through time. We are still listening. We are still digging. We are still learning. And the more we learn, the more clearly we see that the human story is not a story of progress from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to wise, from simple to complex. It is a story of enduring and universal human capacity, expressed in different ways and different forms in every era and every place, but always recognizable as the same essential thing. The desire to understand, the desire to create, the desire to remember, the desire to reach beyond the material world and touch something greater. That desire built the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe. It carved the painted walls of the Zapotec tomb. It laid the raised roads of the Amazon cities. It planted trees in the desert, and it drives us today to excavate the past, to recover what was lost, to give voice again to the echoes of the forgotten world. This is who we are. This is what we have always been. And as long as we keep digging, keep questioning, keep listening, this is what we will always be. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the depths of human history. The world beneath our feet is still speaking. All we have to do is listen.